Okay, this is the basic venture capital formula, page 4, 5, and 6. Valuation assuming future dilution. Basically, dilution is, say, you're an owner of a company and you don't have any shareholders outside of the company. You own 100% of the stock. You bring in a venture capitalist and they invest and they buy 50% of the company. Well, you as the original owner now have been diluted in your ownership from 100% to 50%. So that's the same thing when you have more than one round of financing. If you buy financing in round one, people that buy financing in round two dilute your ownership because now there's more shares, and people that buy shares in round three, since there's more shares now, they've diluted round one and round two. So what they're trying to do is just they're talking about dilution and how you have to figure out if you want to own a certain percentage. Say you know there's going to be three rounds of financing, and you know you want to own 30.4% at the end. Then in round one you've got to buy more than 30.4%, knowing that they're going to sell 7.3% in round two and 3.3% in round three. So basically, they're just going to show you how to figure out if you want to end up with 30.4% at the end, what percent do you need to buy in round one, and then if you want to end up in the second round at 7.3%, but you know that there's going to be another round after that, what percent do you have to buy to end up with 7.3%? And of course, the person buying the third round at 3.3% is going to end up with 3.3% because that's all the financing they're planning on doing. So let's just read through this. As a new stock is issued to later round investors or new employees, the early round investors can expect to suffer dilution, which is a loss of ownership due to the issuing of additional shares. In the single stage financing that they showed earlier in the earlier pages, the first round of financing was assumed to be sufficient until the final year, which was the fifth year. So, in that case, you could buy the guy was buying at 30.4% in that the first example too, and he was going to end up with 30.4% because there was no financing after the first round. So, in addition to estimating the appropriate discount rate for the current round, which is 50% for this guy, the first round VC must now also estimate the discount rates that are most likely to be applied to the following rounds, which we will project for years 2 and years 4. So although a 50% internal rate of return was appropriate for year 0, it is estimated that investors in the company will demand a 40% at year 2, which means in a 5-year investment they'll have 3 more years at a 40% return, and a 25% return in year 4, which means you would expect one year IRR to when you sell the company and the shares. So you'd have 1 year at 25%. The final ownership that each investor must be left with, given a terminal price earnings ratio (PER) of 15, can be calculated using basic valuation formulas. So I just did a brief summary of what we just talked about. They were doing basically. Round one, the guy was going to invest for 5 years with a 50% internal rate of return is what he was requiring. He was going to invest 1.5 million at 5 years, so that'd be 1 plus the 50% to the fifth power over the terminal value. Remember, is the earnings in the fifth year, the profit in the fifth year, the earnings in the fifth year, because that's when they're going to sell it, times the 15 PER, that says price earnings ratio. So that 1.5 million times the 5 years at 50% over the terminal value, which is, this is 37.5 million, the 2.5 million times the 15 equals his 30.4% required return. Round two, it was going to be in year 2, so there'd be 3 years. That money was invested at 40%. They're investing $1 million. So $1 million This gets to the future value of that investment, right? These are getting you the future value. 1 million at 1.4, which is 1. You have to add 1 to the 40% over 3 years. So y to the x over the earnings in the 5th year times the price earnings multiple, which gets you the terminal value, what the company will be worth at the end of 5 years. So that means he's going to own 7.3%. And in year 4, this person's investing for 1 year, 25% IRR. They're investing $1 million. So 1.25, and this would be for 1 year, y to the x, 1 year over the terminal value again, and these are going to have 3.3%. So that's where these numbers come from. Just want to make sure you understand that. Okay, so this is what I just went over. Okay, so note that there are final or terminal ownership shares that each investor requires because they're calculated from the terminal value, which is that this is the terminal value, 15 PER times the final year's earnings. That's what you base the terminal value on. The current investment amount, which is in this guy's case 1.5 million, in these two guys 1 million, and the discount rate, which is the IRR. Remember, IRR, discount rate, whatever you want to call it, that's what they're requiring. 50% for 5 years, 40% for 3 years, 25% for 1 year, because this is in year 4, so the year 5 is only 1 year. This is in year 2, so the year 5 is 3 years, and this is in year 0, so to year 5, he's an initial investor, so to year 5 would be 5 years. They are not affected by the amount of pricing or future investment. So the percent that they want to own, this is at the end, at the terminal date. So that shouldn't be affected by these. So the point is, if you want to own 30.4% at the end of year 5, but you know in year 2 they're going to sell 7.3%, in year 4 they're going to sell 3.3%, then obviously you're going to get diluted. So you have to own more than 30.4% up front. This guy's got to own more than 7.3% up front to end up with 7.3 when he buys. This guy, since he's the last year of financing, he's only got to own 3.3% because he's the last financing round. That's what he'll end up with being. So each investor's required final ownership stake is so that each the required ownership stake is not influenced by other investors' final ownership percentages. However, because the early round investors must purchase enough shares now to make up for the dilution. So if he wants to be here, he's going to be diluted when these two guys buy. So he's got to buy a bigger percent up front when he knows this is coming. So it is in the conversion from the future to the current ownership shares that the effect of the future financings will be felt. So basically, this guy's going to have to buy, I'll tell you right now, 34% to own 30.4% at the end, and then we'll go through that. And that's what they're just talking about. What his current ownership will have to be, so that his future ownership will end up being that. So when he buys it, he's going to have to buy 34%. So when he's diluted by these two guys buying 10.6%, he's going to end up with 30.4%. Okay, so basically it says the ratio of the ownership a given investor will hold as of the terminal year of the project, which is this is what they want to hold, which is their final ownership share, to the percent ownership he holds as of his investment. So he wants to own this at the end, 30.4%, but when he makes his initial investment, he's going to have to buy 34% because he's going to get diluted by these two guys, and they'll show you how to do that. But basically the percent of final ownership, 30.4%, to current ownership, the 34% that he'll have to buy, is called the retention percentage. So if you look at it, basically what they're saying is he's going to have to, if you take the final ownership amount, 30.4, just make sure you do this right, divided by 34, 89.4%. It actually, they show a different percentage, 89.3, but that's because these numbers are actually rounded. This isn't really 30.4. They use the actual numbers in their calculations, I guess. But basically, they're saying that you have to own, this is the amount of, if you initially purchase 34%, this is the retention. You'll retain 89% of that at the end, and that'll get you to the 30.4. So if you got 89.3 is the number they use. So if you take 30.4 divided by 89.3, that tells you that you got to buy 34% up front. So that's what that retention, I'm sorry, I should be down. That's what I was reading these and I wasn't scrolling the page down earlier, but you could have read along with me. So that's what the retention percentage tells you. Your final ownership percentage over your current ownership percentage, what you'd have to buy initially, gives you your retention percentage. So what you could basically do is take your current ownership times your retention percentage, and that should get you your final ownership, or you can take your final ownership percentage, divide it by your retention percentage, and that will give you what you need to purchase up front, your current ownership percentage. Sorry about not scrolling that page, but hopefully you're following along on your sheet. The reduction in ownership over time is caused by the sale of new shares to new investors or the award of additional options to management. To illustrate, an investor's retention ratio will be 75% if a later investor purchases 25% of the company. So in general, the retention percentage equals 1 minus future final, this is really important, final percentage ownerships. And so, for instance, the retention percentage, again, if you're looking back up top here, you know that these two final percentages are going to be the ownership for these two guys. So what this guy needs to do is to end up with his final percentage is 30.4%. He needs to take 1 minus 7.3% and minus 3.3%. Okay. So 1 minus 7.3, excuse me, that's got to be 100. So 1 minus 0.073 minus 0.033, 89.4%. I'm sorry, you can see that. I just did 1 minus this and 1 minus that equals 89.4%. And that is that same retention percentage that they have down below. They have 89.3, but theirs aren't rounded. So basically, once you get that retention percentage, you can divide the 30.4 by that retention percentage, because this 30.4 represents 89.3 or 89.4, whichever number you want to use, percent of what he has to buy up front. So this is 89.3, let's use their number, 89.3% of 100% of what he's got to buy up front to end up with 30.4% once these two guys buy in and dilute his number of shares. So it's pretty simple math. All you do is 1 minus, for instance, this guy now, you take 1 minus the 3.3%, so that gets up to 96.7%, right? So 1, because there's just this one guy in front of 1 minus 3.3%, I guess it'd be 0.033, right? Equals 96.7%. You divide 7.3% by 96.7% because you want to get 100% of the number, right? So you divide this by less than 1, which is 96.7%, and that gets you the 7.6%. So this guy has to buy 7.6% ownership. We're talking about ownership now up front, okay? And that's what they're just trying to show you. These are the retention percentages, and all you do is just subtract the future ones. So it's total future final percent ownerships. So it says thus, because the second and third round investors will hold 7.3% and 3.3% of the final ownership. It's the final ownership, right? The first round investor will take 1 minus 7.3 plus 3.3 equals 89.3% of his original holding. So you know he wants to end up with 30.4%. You divide that by 89.3, right? Because this is that 30.4 represents 89.3% of what he would have to buy up front to end up with 30.4, right? So you divide the 30.4% by the 89.3%, and you get 34%. So basically, we just went through the calculations that they're going to go through. So he wants to end up with 30.4%. You divide that by 89.3% to get 100% of the ownership that he's going to need to buy, which is 34% up front. And then it'll be diluted once these two guys buy, and he'll end up with 30.4%. Okay, and that's the same with this one. 7.3% is what they want to end up with. You know that only one guy's buying in front of him, so 1 minus 3.3% is 96.7%. So you take what he wants to end up with, his final ownership amount, divide it by the retention percentage, and that gets you 7.6%. Of course, the last year no one buys in front of him, after him. I should say in front of him, I mean after him. And these I meant after. These guys purchase after this guy. So no one dilutes him. He's going to be, because these guys have already bought in at that point. Okay? So now they're saying, use the formulas presented earlier. We can calculate the number of shares that each investor must purchase to obtain the above percentages. Okay? So basically what you do is you take the percent of ownership that you want, 1 over 1 minus the percent of that ownership times the old number of shares. Now remember, this gets cumulative. Okay? So for round 1, for instance, okay, he was going to, I think there was 1 million shares up front? What did I do with that page? I think the old ownership was of 1 million shares. The original investors, I forget. Yeah, well, that was just it. It was 1 million shares. Okay, so the people that originally owned the company, they had 1 million shares, right? The founders. These were the founder shares, 1 million shares. So that's the old number of shares. So you take the percent of ownership that he's going to need. Remember, this isn't the final ownership that he wants, but this is what he's got to purchase in round 1, 34%, so that he can end up with 30.4% at the end. So this is really important. When you're figuring this, you're using what he's got to purchase in round 1, so that at the end he ends up with his final ownership of 30.4. So originally the founders had 1 million shares. Okay, he's going to earn 34% of it. So 34% over 1 minus, this is because these shares get added to this, 1 minus 34% times the 1 million shares, the old shares, means that now these in round 1, this is going to be purchased by the VC. Okay, so now you had the original owner shares of 1 million. They still have those. See, they've been diluted, right? They've been diluted. He owns 34% of the company right now. They own 66%. So even the original founders are getting diluted. But now they have 1 million shares still. They didn't get diluted in their number of shares. They got diluted in the percent of ownership because he's bought 515,000 shares. Okay, so now there's 1,515,055 shares. That's the old shares for this guy. Now we know that to get 7.3% in the end, he's got to buy 7.6% when he buys. Okay, so he's buying 7.6% after this round. He will own 7.6%, but once this guy buys, they'll be back down to 7.3%. So 7.6% divided by 1 minus that percentage times the shares outstanding. You have to add these two together. That's the shares outstanding. This plus that equals this. This is the number of shares that is bought in round 2. VC shares. Okay, now you add these two together because remember, now there's these additional shares. That's diluted this guy partially now, and diluted the founders more. So now this guy wants to own 3.3%, which there will be no dilution after that. So it's still 1.1 minus 3.3% times the number of shares outstanding, which is these two added together. And so he's buying 56,522 shares. Okay. So now this is the total number of shares outstanding, right? So it says the price per share can also be calculated. Recall that share price equals investment over the number of shares, right? So this guy spent 1.5 million. Remember, that was the round one investment. And he bought 515,000 shares. So he got in at $2.91. Now this guy bought 124,000 shares, but he paid $1 million. So he paid $8.06 for his shares. And in the third round, he bought 56,522 shares, and he paid $1 million for his share. So he paid $17.69 per share. Okay? So it says the terminal or final year share price can also be calculated. There'll be 1,639,000. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the total number of shares. You got to add these to it. So the 1,639,131 plus these number of shares were purchased. So if you add those together, there's a total of almost 1,000,007 shares outstanding after the third round. Thus, if the market value is 15 times price earning ratio, right? The fifth year, not the year 5, the fifth year earnings at 2.5. That means that it's worth 37,500,000, which is 15 times the 2.5 million divided by the number of shares. So the shares should be worth $22.12, which makes sense, right? The terminal value divided by the total number of shares, which we kept adding shares, we accumulated them together, equals $22.12. Okay, so it says to check, this is page 6, that was page 5. To check this pricing is consistent with the assumed discount rates, multiply each round's share price, what we just figured they bought in at, right, times their IRR for the number of years, and it should equal the $22.12 because this is based on the number of shares left and the terminal value of 37,500,000 and their IRR for the number of years. Okay, and so the last thing, it says options. Stock options are a critical element in attracting and retaining new employees. As with the founder's interest, as options, an option pool will suffer dilution through successive rounds of financing. In order to maintain an options pool that will remain large enough to attract future employees, it is critical at the time of the initial VC financing, management establish the percentage of the company's equity that should be reserved for an options pool, then project the total number of shares that will be issued in all VC rounds. So basically, what they need to do is try to figure out, to the best of their abilities, that they're going to end up with almost 1,000,007 shares at the end. So these guys don't get diluted. So you take the projected total number of shares times the percentage. In this case, they're going to use 5%. And that means how many option pool shares that they should set aside. For example, if they decided 5% of the equity should be reserved for an options pool, and it's estimated there'll be 2 million shares after a final round of VC financing, management will set aside 2 million times 5% or 100,000 shares. Note that at earlier rounds, these 100,000 shares will represent a significantly larger share of the financing, and that always does. These guys in these earlier rounds, remember, this guy originally is going to buy, even though he wants to end up at 30.4%, he's initially going to own 34%. It's going to get diluted. So if you want to end up with 5% pool at the end for the employees, you'll have to, in the initial rounds, before they get more of the financing, more guys buying in, you'll be at 6 or 7% or whatever it is. Okay? So hopefully this helped explain these pages to you.